Picture the last moment of your life that felt completely normal. Not happy, necessarily, just normal. The last moment before something happened that divided your entire existence into a before and an after. For Olivia Whitfield, that moment came on a warm Saturday afternoon in late July, somewhere between the second round of sweet tea and the sun beginning its slow descent over 4 generations of Hargrove family land in rural Tennessee. She was laughing at something her mother had said. She had her shoes off. She was, by all accounts, the most relaxed anyone had seen her in months. And then her husband, of 24 years, reached into a briefcase, pulled out a manila envelope, and handed it to her in front of 63 members of her family. Inside that envelope were divorce papers, signed, filed, and officially served. And nothing, from that moment forward, would ever be the same again. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't throw the envelope back at him or cause the kind of scene that Lucas Whitfield had almost certainly calculated she would create. Instead, Olivia Whitfield sat very still, looked at the man she had given 24 years of her life to, and said 4 words that every single person at that table would carry with them for the rest of their lives. 4 words that, when you hear them, will tell you everything you need to know about who Olivia Hargrove really was. And those 4 words are coming. But first, you need to understand what was already in motion. Because Lucas Whitfield walked into that reunion believing he had won. He had no idea that the most consequential move in this entire story had already been made, not by him. And by a dying man who loved his daughter more than Lucas had ever loved anything in his life. 5 days after that reunion, Olivia's father, Thomas Big Bob Hargrove, passed away peacefully at home. He was 78 years old. And when his will was read the following Friday morning in a conference room in downtown Nashville, the man who had served divorce papers at a family barbecue, the man who hadn't even bothered to attend the reading because he didn't think it had anything to do with him anymore, received a phone call from his own attorney that stopped him cold. The attorney's name was Gerald Holt. And what Gerald Holt said to Lucas Whitfield on that Friday morning was very simple. He said, Lucas, you need to sit down. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our upcoming videos. Now, let's go back to the beginning, because to understand what happened at that will reading, you need to understand what Thomas Hargrove had been quietly doing for the 14 months before that reunion ever took place. Thomas James Hargrove was born in 1945 in a small county in rural Tennessee. His father was a timber worker who owned 200 acres of forested land and very little else. Thomas was not broken by the hardship. By the time he was 30, he had taken that inheritance and an SBA loan he nearly defaulted on twice and turned it into the foundation of what would become Hargrove Timber and Land Holdings. By the time he was 60, he employed 340 people and owned more than 4,000 acres across 3 counties. He drove the same pickup truck for 11 years. He attended the same church since 1974. He was not a man who needed the world to know what he had. He was a man who knew what he had, and that was enough. He had 3 children, 2 boys, Daniel and Roy, who went into the business and earned their father's respect without ever quite earning his deepest trust. And then there was Olivia, the youngest, the only girl, the one who understood intuitively the way her father thought about things, patiently, carefully, with a long view that most people simply don't have the discipline to maintain. She was stubborn the way he was stubborn, loyal the way he was loyal. And she was the one he worried about most. Because the people who are most like you are the people whose pain you feel most acutely. Thomas Hargrove had been feeling a particular quiet pain about his youngest daughter for well over a year. Olivia met Lucas Whitfield in the spring of 1999 at a Chamber of Commerce event in Nashville. She was 23. Newly returned from a design program in New York, already building a reputation as one of the more talented interior designers in her age group. Lucas was 28, newly out of a failed first business venture, and in possession of the kind of surface confidence that, when you are 23 and building something, can look indistinguishable from actual substance. He was handsome. He was ambitious. And he had a way of looking at you when you spoke that made you feel like the most important person in the room. A quality that is either a gift or a weapon, depending entirely on the character of the person who has it. In Lucas Whitfield's case, time would make the answer unmistakably clear. 6 weeks into their relationship, Lucas had already met Thomas, not nervously, hoping for approval, but by calling him the morning after their introduction at a family dinner and requesting a meeting. Not to ask permission, to pitch Thomas on investing in a real estate project. Thomas sat across from Lucas that afternoon and understood several things simultaneously: that Lucas was intelligent, that Lucas was driven, and that what Lucas Whitfield wanted from life was not a life at all, but an audience for one. Thomas approved the investment anyway. And not because the project was exceptional, but because he wanted to keep Lucas close enough to watch. They married in 2001. Thomas walked his daughter down the aisle with a steady hand and dry eyes, and the expression of a man who has made peace with a decision he isn't entirely certain about, but loves the person enough to support. Olivia was radiant. She was also, for the first time in her professional life, in the process of setting aside the career she had been building. Lucas had asked her to, not as an ultimatum, but in the particular way that certain men make requests that feel like love when they are actually expressions of convenience. He told her he needed someone to manage the household, that his business demanded full attention, that her talents would be better used building something together. She believed him, for she closed her client list, stored her portfolio, and became, to anyone who didn't know what she'd been before, simply Lucas Whitfield's wife. What she actually became was the invisible load-bearing wall of an entire life that Lucas constructed around himself and took credit for entirely. For the first decade, there were moments that were genuinely good. There were 2 children, Tyler and Avery, remarkable kids by every account. Olivia raised them almost entirely alone, in the way that many women in long marriages raise children almost entirely alone, doing the work so completely that it becomes invisible to the person who benefits most from it. Lucas was present the way men who believe their professional success constitutes a form of parenting are present, occasionally, loudly, and always on their own terms. He was, as by his own accounting, a good father. By the accounting of anyone actually in that house, he was a man who lived in the same building as his children and called it fatherhood. The business grew. Whitfield Property Group became a mid-size real estate development firm in the Nashville market, with commercial properties, residential developments, and a growing presence in surrounding counties. Lucas was a skilled negotiator and relentless networker. What he was less willing to acknowledge was the role Thomas Hargrove's name, connections, and capital had played in making any of it possible. 8 years into the marriage, during a cash flow crisis that nearly ended the company entirely, it was Thomas who provided a $2.3 million loan, not as a gift, but as a formal promissory note with repayment terms. Lucas signed it, made several early payments, and then, as the company recovered, quietly began to regard the debt as a relic of a difficult period that no longer required his attention. He had never fully repaid it. Thomas had never pushed. Thomas had his reasons, and those reasons would become very clear on a Friday morning in Nashville. What nobody outside Thomas Hargrove's private circle knew, what Lucas specifically did not know, was that Thomas had been a silent partner in Whitfield Property Group since the company's founding. Through a shell company called Blue Ridge Holdings, registered quietly in Delaware, Thomas held a 35% equity interest in his son-in-law's company. He had never told Lucas, never told Olivia, never told anyone outside of Charles Pemberton, his family attorney, who had maintained the arrangement with 31 years of professional discretion. Thomas had his reasons for the secrecy. He would explain them in a voice that would fill a conference room and land on Lucas Whitfield like a ceiling coming down.
I can't believe you did that.
The marriage began to shift in the second decade, not dramatically, in the way that slow damage works, gradually, quietly, in the spaces between things. Lucas began traveling more. Business trips became longer. Explanations became shorter. He developed the habit of preemptive irritation, becoming short-tempered at home to manufacture distance without explaining it. Olivia noticed. Of course she noticed. She was an intelligent woman who had spent 20 years paying close attention to a person who had stopped paying attention to her. She had not yet named what she was sensing, not out loud. But she felt it the way you feel a change in weather before the sky shows you anything. Her mother, Carol, noticed too. She had watched Lucas Whitfield for 24 years, with the patient attention of a woman who loved her daughter too much to say the wrong thing at the wrong time, but never stopped watching. Thomas, who could read Carol's face the way he read weather patterns over his own land, saw it in how she watched Lucas at family dinners, heard it in what she didn't say during their private conversations. And it confirmed, with the quiet certainty of a man whose instincts had been reliable for 7 decades, that something had changed. Something was wrong. Thomas Hargrove, who had never waited for a problem to announce itself before addressing it, made a phone call. 14 months before the reunion, Thomas called a private investigation firm in Nashville. Not out of emotion, out of the same calm, methodical discipline he applied to every consequential decision of his life. The firm confirmed what Thomas had sensed within 3 weeks. Lucas Whitfield was conducting an ongoing affair with a woman named Lynette Cross, the senior leasing manager at his own company. The relationship had been ongoing for approximately 2 years. It was not a momentary lapse. It was a sustained, deliberate parallel life Lucas had been maintaining while attending family dinners, showing up at Thomas's property for Thanksgiving and Christmas and the annual reunion, sitting across from a dying man and accepting his hospitality, eating his food, breathing his air, and lying through every minute of it. Now, Thomas reviewed the investigation report on a Tuesday evening. He read it twice. When he finished, he folded the report, placed it in the center drawer of his desk, and sat quietly for a while. He did not call Lucas. He did not tell Olivia. What Thomas did, after sitting with the weight of what he'd read, was reach for a legal pad and begin making a list. 2 columns. Left. What I know. Right. What needs to happen. It took him 40 minutes to complete both columns. Then he called Charles Pemberton, and the plan began. Pemberton had been Thomas's attorney since 1993. He was meticulous, low-voiced, and possessed of the quality that separates truly exceptional attorneys from merely competent ones, the ability to understand not just what a client is asking for legally, but what they are trying to accomplish as a human being. When Thomas outlined what the investigation had found and what he intended to do, Pemberton listened without interruption for 22 minutes. He came back with a blueprint for one of the most quietly comprehensive pieces of estate architecture he had constructed in 31 years of practice. The plan had 3 components. The first was the most immediately powerful. Blue Ridge Holdings, through which Thomas held his 35% interest in Whitfield Property Group, would be formally restructured so that upon Thomas's death, those shares transferred directly and exclusively to Olivia, not as a marital asset subject to division in divorce proceedings, as an inheritance. Because under Tennessee law, inheritance is treated separately from marital property, which meant no matter what Lucas did, no matter how the divorce unfolded, no matter what arguments his attorneys made, those shares would belong to Olivia, only Olivia. The second component was the promissory note. The outstanding balance was still owed. Pemberton confirmed that the original document contained a clause calling the entire remaining balance due immediately upon Thomas's death, secured against company equity. In the event of default, and Lucas, who had not been servicing the note and had neither the cash nor the inclination to pay $2 million in a lump sum during a divorce proceeding, the estate was entitled to an additional equity position representing full satisfaction of the debt. That position amounted to 16%. 35 plus 16, 51%. Majority ownership of Lucas Whitfield's own company. He transferred cleanly and legally to the woman he had served divorce papers to at a family barbecue. The third component was what Pemberton would later call, in private, the betrayal clause, an amendment to Thomas's will, drafted with extreme legal precision, stating that any individual who initiates divorce proceedings against a Hargrove blood descendant forfeits all rights, interest, and claims to any Hargrove estate asset, instrument, or business interest, effective immediately and irrevocably upon the filing of said proceedings. Thomas had needed the filing to be the trigger, not the delivery, not the scene. The filing, because Lucas was the kind of man who treated every significant act as a legal proceeding first and a human event second. And 3 days before the reunions, on July 23rd, Lucas Whitfield walked into his attorney's office and signed the filing documents. 3 days before he stood up at that picnic table. 3 days before he thought the game had begun. He had already lost. Now you need to understand Lynette Cross, because she is not a minor character. She was 38 years old, talented, professionally ambitious, and complicit in a sustained deception that caused real harm to a real family. But who she was and what she ultimately did is more complicated than the role of the other woman allows for. Lynette had joined Whitfield Property Group 4 years earlier and risen quickly to a senior position on the strength of genuinely exceptional work. She was also, for 2 years, in a relationship with the man who ran the company, under the belief that Lucas had actively cultivated through specific, deliberate language, that their relationship was heading toward a formalized future. None of it materialized. She was passed over for the COO position she'd been told to expect. Her salary hadn't been reviewed in 18 months, and when Lucas told her, in a tone she described as cheerful, that the divorce was filed and they could finally be open, something in Lynette Cross went very still and very clear. She had been preparing for 6 months. She had forwarded emails to a personal account, specific emails involving financial reporting that didn't align with the numbers she worked with daily. She had photographed documents showing expenses routed through a personal LLC with no apparent business purpose. She had kept a meticulous, dated notebook of conversations and observations. When Lucas told her their future was about to begin, she looked at the man who had promoted her with one hand and leveraged her with the other for 2 years, and she called Patricia Wells, Olivia Whitfield's divorce attorney. She showed up to that meeting carrying a thumb drive, a folder of printed emails, and that notebook. Patricia Wells, who had practiced family law in Nashville for 30 years, would later describe that meeting as the most consequential 90 minutes of her career. What Lynette brought were records, financial records, internal emails suggesting Lucas had materially misrepresented company revenue to outside investors, documents showing over $400,000 in expenses over 3 years routed through a personal LLC, a documentation of a commercial property acquisition involving representations to a lender that appeared to be inaccurate. Taken together, these described a pattern of financial conduct that, in the right hands, constituted the kind of problem that cannot be negotiated away. Patricia Wells spent that evening with a forensic accountant. By morning, she had a list of questions and a growing understanding that Lucas Whitfield's divorce strategy, built entirely on the assumption that he held all the leverage, was constructed on ground far less stable than he knew. When asked later why she came forward, Lynette said, He told me I was his future. Then he passed me over for a man who played golf badly and read mediocre books. I decided my future was better than his story. It is a good line. And it is also a statement about something real. about the way certain people use others as instruments and then express genuine surprise when those instruments refuse to stay in their assigned positions. Lucas had spent 2 years carefully managing 2 women. What he had not understood is that the people being managed are also watching, also thinking, also in their own time, preparing. Neither Olivia nor Lynette had coordinated. Neither had needed to. That convergence, that double door closing simultaneously from 2 different directions, was something Lucas had never once accounted for. Now let us go back to the reunion. The 23rd annual Hargrove family reunion began on a Saturday morning the way it always began, with Thomas Hargrove on his front porch at 7 in the morning with a cup of coffee, watching his family arrive. And he was thinner than the year before. The cancer had been working for 8 months, and while it had not stripped him of his dignity or clarity, it had taken some weight, and the people who loved him could see it. People hugged a little longer. They laughed a little louder. They took more photographs than usual because people take more photographs when they know they are in the middle of something that will not come again. Olivia had arrived with a casserole dish and a new dress and a feeling in her chest she couldn't entirely account for. She told herself it was about her father's health. That was part of it. She set up her table, greeted her brothers, sat with her mother on the porch. Carol took her hand, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. The kind of silence that only happens between people who have known each other long enough to communicate everything without words. Lucas arrived with her and opened the car door, because Lucas always opened the car door in public. That was the performance of the marriage. Small, visible gestures of consideration that existed entirely for the audience and had long since ceased to have any relationship to what happened when the audience was gone. By mid-afternoon, Lucas had been on his phone more than he had spoken to anyone at the reunion. He stepped away twice, speaking in the low, clipped tone of a man conducting business he doesn't want overheard. What Olivia didn't know, what no one at that table knew except the man about to do it, was that the calls had nothing to do with real estate. He was coordinating with Gerald Holt, who had arranged for a process server to drive out to the Hargrove property. Lucas had chosen the reunion deliberately. He had decided, with the calculus of a man who has confused cruelty with power his entire life, that the most effective way to establish dominance was to make the serving of papers into a public event, to make Olivia feel small in front of the people who made her feel largest. He thought it was strategic. He thought it was smart. What it actually was the last piece of evidence Thomas Hargrove had been waiting for. At 3:47 in the afternoon, a gray sedan pulled up. An unfamiliar man got out. I dressed too formally for a Saturday in rural Tennessee. Lucas stood up the moment the man appeared, that immediate, confident rise, and it was noticed, and it would be remembered. The process server approached the table. He asked for Olivia by name. She confirmed it. He placed the envelope in front of her. Lucas stood 4 feet away and watched. The entire gathering went utterly still, the confusion arriving on faces, then comprehension a second later. A woman bringing her hand to her mouth, an uncle rising from his chair, the children in the background oblivious, still playing in the grass. Olivia looked at the envelope. She looked at her husband. He met her eyes and held them. The expression of a man who has prepared for this moment and believes it is going his way. He was waiting for the tears. He was waiting for the collapse. What he got was something he had not prepared for. Olivia picked up that envelope, set it back down, looked at Lucas one more time with an expression witnesses would spend years trying to describe accurately, and said, clearly and without any tremor in her voice, I expected more class. That was all. 4 words. Quiet enough that only the nearest people heard, loud enough that they have never stopped echoing. She then stood up, walked to the chair where her father was sitting and sat down beside him. Thomas put his arm around her. He did not look at Lucas. He simply held his daughter and looked out over his land with the expression of a man who has known for a long time that a particular day was coming and who had, long ago, decided how to meet it. Lucas left 20 minutes later without speaking to Thomas. He drove to a hotel in Nashville, told Lynette it was done, poured himself a drink, and sat with the confidence of a man who has made his move and is waiting for the board to reflect what he believes it already shows. He did not think about Thomas Hargrove's expression on that porch. He did not think about the way Thomas had not looked at him when he left. He thought about the future, his future. He would not see Thomas Hargrove alive again. He thought that was fine. He was wrong about almost everything. Thomas Hargrove died at home on the morning of Thursday, July 31st. He had spent those 5 days in a state of calm that people around him would describe as complete. Not resignation, completion. On the Sunday after the reunion, he had called Charles Pemberton for a 41-minute conversation. And he gave Pemberton one specific instruction. There was a recording he had made, a personal letter directed specifically at Lucas Whitfield, and he wanted it played before any formal documents were read, on a small recorder in the center of the conference table. Everyone present in silence until it finished. He would not be in that room in person, but he was going to be in it. Thomas was certain of that. His last communication with Olivia was a voicemail. She still has it. What he said, in the slow, unhurried voice of a man who has always understood that the most important things deserve to be said simply, was, "Everything I built was always for you. I just needed to make sure you knew where to find it. No drama, no elaborate farewell, just a father at the end of a life saying the one thing he most needed his daughter to hear. He died the way he had lived, on his own terms, with everything in order, having protected what he loved and left nothing important unsaid." The reading of Thomas James Hargrove's last will and testament took place on Friday, August 1st. The family arrived first. Olivia, composed and dressed with quiet elegance, her mother Carol, her brothers Daniel and Roy. Charles Pemberton arrived precisely on time, carrying a leather portfolio and a small digital recording device, which he set in the center of the table without explanation. Gerald Holt arrived a few minutes later, as Lucas's legal proxy, because Lucas, who had assumed with casual confidence that Thomas's will was someone else's concern now, had not bothered to attend. He was at his office. He had sent his lawyer so his time would not be wasted. And that decision, the decision not to be in the room, would be understood as the final, definitive expression of everything Lucas Whitfield had ever gotten wrong about the Hargrove family. Pemberton greeted everyone and then said in the unhurried way he said everything, "Before we begin, Thomas asked that I play a recording. He made it 3 weeks ago. It will take approximately 8 minutes. He asked that no one speak until it has finished." Holt uncapped his pen. Olivia folded her hands. Carol sat very straight. Pemberton pressed play. And Thomas Hargrove's voice filled the room, gravelly, warm, southern, entirely unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world. He began with his family. He said that everything he had done in the last 14 months, he had done out of love for Olivia. More than the land, more than the business, more than anything else he had built. He said he had not acted out of anger. He had acted out of preparation. He said a father's job is not finished when his children are grown. It is finished when he knows they are safe. Then he turned his attention, clearly and without hesitation, to the man who was not in the room. "For the man who is not here today, Mr. Whitfield, I want you to hear this directly from me." Gerald Holt's pen stopped. He set it down carefully on the table. Thomas's voice continued. He said he knew about the affair. He had known for 14 months. He knew the woman's name. He knew how long it had been ongoing. He knew about the loan that had never been repaid. He knew about the assets not disclosed in the prenuptial agreement. And then he said the thing that changed everything. He said he knew about the 35% interest he had held, silently, in Whitfield Property Group since the company's founding. a fact Lucas had never known, never uncovered, because Thomas had not wanted it uncovered, because Thomas had understood 20 years earlier that the most powerful position is not the one everyone can see. Holt had stopped writing entirely. He sat with the expression of a man doing mathematics he does not like. Thomas said he had held these things quietly because he had hoped he was wrong. He was not wrong. When Lucas chose to humiliate his daughter in front of their family, on their land at their table, he had demonstrated for the last time exactly who he was. And in doing so, he had triggered every mechanism Thomas had spent 14 months putting in place. He said he did not wish Lucas harm, and he asked that be believed. He simply wished Lucas to understand one thing, that for 24 years, Lucas Whitfield had been operating inside a structure he did not build, had not seen, and had never once thought to look for. And now that Thomas was gone and the mechanisms were triggered, Lucas would finally see the full shape of the thing he'd been standing on. At the moment, it was no longer there to stand on. Then Thomas said goodbye. Simply, clearly, with the finality of a man who had earned the right to the last word. Nobody spoke for several seconds after the recording ended. Olivia had both hands over her face. Carol sat with her eyes closed. The brothers were looking at the table, but Holt was looking at nothing, processing information arriving faster than he could absorb it. Pemberton allowed the silence to exist as long as it needed to. Then he opened the leather portfolio and began to read. Clause 1. Thomas bequeathed his 35% interest in Whitfield Property Group, held through Blue Ridge Holdings for 22 years, to Olivia Whitfield as a direct inheritance, structured intentionally as an inheritance, not a marital asset, protected from the divorce proceedings in their entirety, belonging to Olivia, only Olivia. Clause 2. The outstanding balance on the promissory note, bearing Lucas's signature, was hereby called due in full. In the event of default, the estate was entitled to an additional equity position representing full satisfaction of the debt, 16%. A 35 plus 16, 51%. Majority ownership of Whitfield Property Group transferred by law, inheritance, and the terms of a document Lucas had signed 8 years ago and apparently stopped thinking about, to the woman he had served divorce papers to in front of 63 relatives 4 days earlier. Holt asked if he could step outside to make a phone call. Pemberton said quietly that he would prefer Holt remain until the reading was complete. There was one more clause. Holt sat back down. Pemberton read the betrayal clause. Any individual who initiates divorce proceedings against a Hargrove blood descendant forfeits all rights, interest, and claims to any Hargrove estate asset, instrument, or business interest, effective immediately and irrevocably upon the filing of said proceedings. Lucas Whitfield had filed on July 23rd, 3 days before the reunion, 3 days before he stood up from his chair and handed his wife that envelope. The filing was the trigger, and he had pulled it himself. Pemberton pressed play one final time, because Thomas had asked that the closing lines be replayed after the clauses were read. The words came through clearly. "You have been operating inside a structure you did not build. I hope the lesson is instructive." Holt left the room immediately after and was on the phone before he reached the hallway. Lucas Whitfield, in his office, where he had been all morning, heard his attorney's voice and understood within 30 seconds that something had gone catastrophically wrong. Holt told him to sit down. Lucas said he was already sitting. Holt said to stay there. And the conversation lasted 40 minutes. When it ended, Lucas sat without moving for a long time. The person who had told him he had already won, that the business was protected, the prenup gave him leverage, 6 to 8 months, and they could both move forward. That version of events was gone. His wife owned 51% of his company. The prenuptial agreement had been invalidated due to his own prior concealment of assets, identified by Olivia's attorney within 48 hours of being retained. The financial documents Lynette had provided were in the hands of a forensic accountant and had been forwarded to the relevant regulatory authorities. Everything he thought was fortified was built on assumptions. And the man who had built the actual structure, the real one, though standing underneath everything Lucas thought he owned, was gone, had said what he needed to say, had done what he needed to do. The months that followed were not kind to Lucas Whitfield. The regulatory inquiry resulted in significant fines and a consent decree placing his business activities under a monitoring agreement for 5 years. He was removed from day-to-day operations of Whitfield Property Group by a shareholder vote, the majority shareholder being Olivia Whitfield, née Hargrove, who voted to install new executive leadership. The divorce settlement became a prolonged and expensive negotiation that moved against him with each new piece of evidence. He did not go to prison, but what the case did was strip away systematically the professional standing and financial position he had spent 24 years building. Lynette Cross settled her own employment dispute and moved on with the quiet practicality of someone who made a decision and is not interested in revisiting it. Olivia Whitfield became the majority owner of a company she had never asked to own. She responded the way she responded to every unexpected thing, practically, intelligently, without drama. She hired a new CEO to handle operations, engaged a financial advisor, and initiated a restructuring that within 18 months had stabilized the company's finances and added 17 new positions. She also, quietly, reopened her interior design practice, the one she had closed 20 years before at Lucas's request. Her first commission was redesigning the main house on the Hargrove family property. She said in a brief interview that she had spent 20 years being part of someone else's story. She was now interested in writing her own. The question that people return to is Thomas's 14 months of silence. He knew. From the moment the investigation confirmed his suspicions, he knew everything. And for 14 months, he said nothing to Olivia. He gave her none of the information that would have allowed her to protect herself sooner. There are people who believe this was paternalistic, that Olivia deserved the truth the moment Thomas had it, and that withholding it, however well-intentioned, took agency from her at the moment she most needed it. That argument has merit and deserves to be held alongside the rest of this story. There are also people who believe Thomas made the only decision he could, that if he had told Olivia what he knew, she would have confronted Lucas. The confrontation would have accelerated a timeline Thomas wasn't ready for, the legal structures would not have been in place, and the outcome would have been entirely different, and almost certainly worse. That what Olivia needed was not the truth early. She needed the truth at exactly the right moment, with everything already in position, with nothing left to chance. That the gift was not only the money and the equity and the legal architecture. The gift was the certainty, the knowledge that someone who loved her had been working the entire time so that when the ground fell away, she would not fall with it. What Thomas Hargrove understood, what Lucas Whitfield never once understood, is that power does not announce itself. It does not need to be seen to be real. The most durable structures are the ones that hold weight without being noticed, that do their work quietly and reveal their nature only when tested. Thomas built his business that way, he built his family that way, he built his protection of Olivia that way. Lucas had spent his entire adult life performing power, making it visible, making it loud, making it a show that required an audience. He served divorce papers at a family reunion because he could not conceive of strength that didn't require witnesses. Thomas had learned that the strength which changes things is almost always the kind that has no witnesses until after it has already done what it set out to do. There is one more thing. The voicemail. The one she still has saved. The one she will never delete.
Everything I built was
always for you. I just needed to make sure you knew where to find it. That is a father, not performing love, not describing love, but demonstrating it in the only currency that ever actually matters. What you did with your time, your attention, and your intelligence, quietly, over years, for the people you could not protect any other way. Not the legal mechanisms, not the financial structure, not the brilliant architecture of the betrayal clause. All of that is just the form the love took. The love itself was simpler. A father who built things, a daughter who deserved them, and a man who mistook a 24-year advantage for a permanent one, until a Friday morning in Nashville, when a small recorder on a conference table played a voice he had never taken seriously, saying the last thing he would ever say, and meaning every word of it. Well, what do you think about what Thomas chose to do? Was he right to protect Olivia in silence? To arrange everything without telling her? To give her not the knowledge but the outcome?
Thank you, Dad.
Or did she deserve to know the moment he found out? To make her own choices with the full picture in front of her? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear where you land on this because I don't think there is a clean answer. Only an honest one. And if this story moved you, if it made you think about the people in your own life who have been protecting you in ways you haven't been able to see, stay with us. We have more stories like this. Please don't forget to subscribe, hit the bell, and come back.
It is
Some
what it is
stories
now.
deserve to be told. This was one of them. This